Thank you very much for being here. My name is Marissa Parham. As you know, I'm a professor of English here at Amherst College. I'm also the director of 5 College Digital Humanities, which works across the 5 colleges. I'm very happy today to introduce Roopika Risam, who's here to talk to us from Salem State, also in Massachusetts. And she is our, I believe, 4th speaker of the year, but our 1st speaker of the new year, which is very exciting. I feel like with the ways things have been going with weather and otherwise, I'm so grateful for a spot of intellectual sunshine. Right now, I think we all need something, and I have a sneaking suspicion that this is going to be it. As you all know from other places, I personally, in 5 College Digital Humanities in general, is deeply invested in the question of what it means to think about the critical digital humanities. To not accept that the newest set of tools and ways of looking at things and the instrumentalization sometimes of learning necessarily will always mean something good, or that, at least when we imagine innovation as being something that we have to care about, then how do we manage to care about it in the ways we've already very carefully constructed as important? How do we bring even extant discourses of critique alongside what we generally think of as the new, especially when we know the new, no matter what, is always going to keep coming. So today I'm really excited to hear what Roopika, Professor Risam, has to say to us. And afterwards we'll have time for questions, and I think you'll enjoy this talk today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you so much, Marissa, for your introduction, and thank you to everybody who came out today. I'm really excited to be here and to be part of your Digital Humanities Speaker Series. And in one of those kind of cruel winter ironies, I think we've actually gotten more snow in Boston than here, so this is like being on a tropical vacation for me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit today about my work in postcolonial digital humanities, which is the subject of a manuscript that I'm currently finishing for Northwestern University Press. And what the project does is look at the ways that postcolonial studies and the digital humanities have intersected and come into contact over the past 20 years or so. And I've chosen to frame this talk around what we might call the critical digital humanities, or the meta discourse that surrounds the digital humanities, particularly as it engages, or indeed as it doesn't engage, with thorny issues of power, labor, access, or questions of difference like race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, and so on. So what I'm going to do is briefly contextualize the critical digital humanities before going on to talk about some of the theoretical and project-based moments where postcolonial studies and the digital humanities overlap. So this is the stock moment in any digital humanities presentation where a definition should be offered, and the definition is always subject to debate. But here's one as good as any from Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who's known for her work in digital humanities and scholarly communication. And this is from an interview from 2013, and Fitzpatrick says, "For me, it has to do with the work that gets done at the crossroads of digital media and traditional humanistic study. And that happens in 2 different ways. On the one hand, it's bringing the tools and techniques of digital media to bear on traditional humanistic questions, but it's also bringing humanistic modes of inquiry to bear on digital media." And she goes on to say that digital humanities is a sort of moving back and forth across those lines, thinking about what computing is, how it functions in our culture, and then using those computing technologies to think more about traditional aspects of culture. And this is what we might call a big tent definition of digital humanities. It's a more expansive definition that includes the predecessor field of humanities computing, which emphasized textual studies, from which digital humanities comes, but also genealogies from new media studies and communications, rhetoric and composition, computers and writing, and science and technology studies, and others. So recently, in the digital humanities, we've seen the emergence of critical digital humanities as a term. And this is a tweet from Alex Hill at Columbia from September, which indicates some of the surprise that many of us felt when we saw that there was, in fact, a job in critical digital humanities, a professorship, being advertised on the MLA job list. And for those of us who work in this area, in areas like postcolonial digital humanities or transform DH or global digital humanities, the idea that critical digital humanities is somehow envisioned as a hiring category is this very foreign idea, because we've really had some struggles trying to make the case for the importance of the critical angle on the digital humanities. And suddenly, well, if there's a job in it, it's a real thing. So that was sort of a bizarre moment. But it was just one job. This is a Google trend analysis to give you a sense of the relative popularity of digital humanities versus critical digital humanities as Google search terms. So methodologically, you can't really belabor this because there actually isn't a critical volume of search data on critical digital humanities, but the flat line is a kind of nice little metaphor. Well, not the flat line. It's not a metaphor. But the kind of relative difference in the frequency of searches gives a sort of sense of the fact that digital humanities itself does have currency as a term in the larger ecology of stuff people enter into Google, but critical digital humanities doesn't, and that sort of tells you the relationship between the two. But there's sort of hope because this is becoming a term of more interest. So what exactly does critical digital humanities mean, and where does it come from? The term itself is attributed to David Barry, I put a quote of his up here, in his 2014 book, Critical Theory in the Digital. That's sort of the one textual appearance of critical digital humanities in book form. And he writes, sort of in general, about the importance of thinking critically about computation. Additional critical technical practices and habits in the use of new digital methods and tools are needed, such as anti-social media, hacking, critical encryption practices, iteracy, that's not a typo, and critical digital humanities and politically engaged computer praxis. This will ensure that we can read and write outside the streams of data collected in the service of computational capitalism and government monitoring, and so avoid the shadow of what we might call the dialectic of computationality. So this quote hits on some of the major themes that animate the critical digital humanities, thinking about things like the surveillance state and the relationship between data and the NSA and PRISM and the complicity of technology with global capitalism. But the origins of critical digital humanities predate the existence of the term. And actually, this reflects a trend that you often will see in digital humanities, which is that retrofitting is really just what we do. Because if you were to ask some people what they thought the number one phrase uttered by digital humanists would be, it's probably, I was doing digital humanities before there was even digital humanities. And, well, rest assured, people were doing critical digital humanities before it was even called critical digital humanities. And the watershed moment in the emergence of critical digital humanities is Alan Liu's 2011 talk, Where is Cultural Criticism in the Digital Humanities? And he advises digital humanists will need to find ways to show that thinking critically about metadata, for instance, scales into thinking critically about the power, finance, and other governance protocols of the world. So again, we get back to these questions of power, capital, the governmentality, and it's a retrofit. It's sort of we will now look at our metadata and think critically about it and think about what kind of work it can do, culturally speaking. And following up on Lou's question, Fred Gibbs has asked, where is the criticism in digital humanities? Not even cultural criticism. Where is criticism, period? And he basically argues that the field's meta discourse has yet to be developed. And so he actually suggests that such a discourse would do two particular things. One, that it must be concerned with both interpretation and evaluation, and two, is central to establishing the importance of the kind of scholarly and even cultural work that it does. So in a sense, there are some who argue that the kind of critical digital humanities is more of digital humanities talking about itself. But at the same time, if we don't have these ways of talking about the work we do, we can't really talk about the limitations or the ways that the work we do is implicated in reinforcing the canon or reinforcing hierarchies of power within knowledge that already exist. And there have been so many interventions now around critical digital humanities that I'm not going to keep going into them, although I do want to mention, if you're interested in race in particular, Tara McPherson's work on why the digital humanities is so white is really important, and Amy Earhart's work on looking at humanities, computing, and race in her essay, Can Information Be Unfettered, are really important. And then also, for a non-North American point of view, Domenico Fioramonte's work towards a cultural critique of the digital humanities. So I did want to mention those because I think it's important to cite the kind of a broad range of work that's being done, but I'm going to actually focus really on the juncture of postcolonial studies and the digital humanities, because that's one way we can think about critical digital humanities is through the lens of postcolonial studies. So just for a little bit of background, postcolonial digital humanities is a term that I coined along with my colleague Adeline Coe in 2012 with the goal of creating space for global explorations of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability within cultures of technology. And it really began with the Twitter hashtag DHPOCO. We were using the hashtag to try and find people who were working at the intersections of postcolonial studies and the digital humanities. And so for me, when we talk about making and the role of building in the digital humanities, I think one of the important ways to think about building is the building of communities. And so the work of postcolonial digital humanities emerged as the task of community building. I didn't have an intellectual community for this work. Make one. And that's the attitude. And this, of course, is the tendency towards retrofitting in the digital humanities that I previously mentioned all over again, because indeed, there were people doing postcolonial digital humanities before it was even called postcolonial digital humanities. The earliest of these projects emerged in the 90s, like George P. Lando's website, the Postcolonial Web, or Deepika Bari's Postcolonial Studies at Emory site. These were largely informational sites, web pages, one from the mid-90s, that were focused on representing the field in making the knowledge of postcolonial studies accessible to the public, particularly at this moment when the field was so new. And the audience was also largely students who'd learn about it. So these projects really show how the emergence of internet culture was viewed as an important moment for postcolonial studies scholars who wanted to establish sites of knowledge for the field and disseminate information about key terms, theorists, the stakes for the field, and publicizing the important work that postcolonial writers and scholars were doing. This is the Postcolonial Web in all its 1995 GeoCities design aesthetics, which you have to love nostalgically if you're old enough. And Landau's known for his work on hypertext. And what's interesting about the Postcolonial Web is that on the one hand, he's talking about a site for postcolonial studies on the World Wide Web. But given that he's interested in hypertext and what happens when words get linked to each other, and then thinking about how that transposes onto hyperlinks, the act of clicking on a link and being taken to another page, that I think there's a double entendre here in terms of the web is the web of knowledge of postcolonial studies and the ways that you can experience the connections between different texts and different writers simply through clicking the pages. This site it hasn't been updated in at least a decade, I think, but it's intentionally preserved. So you can go look at it and see what was postcolonial studies de rigueur circa 2000. But between the 90s and relatively recently, so basically I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, the ways that scholars have been largely engaging with the intersections of postcolonial and digital, postcolonial studies and digital humanities has been through theory And that changes sort of once we get into this decade. But there are some exceptions, but largely the work that we've seen comes out of science and technology studies, new media studies, and even now critical code studies. So Sandra Harding is a really important figure in terms of having put postcolonial studies and feminist theory and science and technology studies in conversation with each other. She has proposed that making that conversation happen allows scholars to rethink narratives of technological development that are centered on the West and to re-center the center of science, to revisit traditions from non-Western cultures with an eye towards the perspectives that those knowledge traditions offer, and that post-colonial science and technology studies offers a way for thinking about how imperialism and colonialism have shaped value in scientific discourse. So how what we value in science is largely tied to how we value knowledge production in the so-called West over the East, or we prefer to now to say in the global North versus the global South. So she is an important figure in terms of thinking about theoretical foundations for how we bring post-colonial studies and digital humanities in conversation with each other. Coming out of science and technology studies is post-colonial computing, which has been developed largely by Lily Irani, Paul Dorish, and Kavita Philip, among others. And their work responds to a body of scholarship that's called Human-Computer Interaction for Development. Say that 5 times fast. And it's a scholarly community that thinks about the relationship between technology and development. And their work has basically been to put the post-colonial perspective into the idea of using technology for development to raise questions of authority, power, and legitimacy that are evoked in the rhetoric of development. From a post-colonial perspective, development itself is a fraught term, but so they're injecting that critique into the human-computer interaction conversation. And so, they take a look at how culture and power underlie the development of technology, and so emphasizing that good design, what's called good design of technology, is often associated with the aesthetics and design practices, again, of the West, whereas there is no such thing as a universally good design, that there's actually cultural contexts and constructs in which technology design exists. So they've done important work foregrounding that. And again, this is an attempt to decenter Western forms of knowledge as the kind of primary site of value for technology. More recently, decolonial computing, which takes a decolonial perspective, has arisen in response to postcolonial computing, and it's a critique of it as well. And this is work being done by Saeed Mustafa Ali, who really thinks about computing in relationship to Charles Mills's work on social contract theory. And he has this great book in which he argues basically that white supremacy subtends the social contract. And so drawing on Mills, Ali argues that even progressive approaches to technology like post-colonial computing have not really paid sufficient attention to the role of systemic racism and white supremacy. And he basically argues that this is because post-colonial studies itself hasn't foregrounded racial materiality. I mean, depending on which post-colonialist you ask, some would take exception to that statement. But he suggests to think about Walter Mignola's work on delinking and the border as alternate ways rather than kind of the post-colonial as a way of thinking about technology. And so an example of this is he talks about the development of faces on humanoid robots, and that the development of these faces is sort of thought of as I guess we could say it's post-racial. I mean, it's thought to just not have anything to do with race whatsoever, which is a kind of false economy of race. I mean, he suggests that these robots themselves, like, I don't know, the ones that Google appears to be building in Boston that you can kick. Have you seen this video? there's these Google's building these giant robots, and they're so advanced that if you kick them, they're not going to fall over. They redirect themselves. Just Google it. It's a good video. But how is the kind of aspect of robotics not engaging with these issues, and how is that complicit in white supremacy? That's what he's talking about. So that's the moment where critical race theory is kind of coming into the conversation about technology. And in doing so, offering a new way of thinking about power and knowledge production and development. Also, I want to mention the work in new media studies that's been really important from post-colonial perspectives. So Lisa Nakamura and Alondra Nelson and Tara McPherson talk extensively in their scholarship about the role of internet culture and its implication in cultural biases and norms and practices. To talk a little bit about people who are specifically doing post-colonial work, Radhika Gujala's work interprets silence and voice in online spaces, and she uses theories of globalization and technology as frames. Digital subalternity, the role of the subaltern in cyberspace, is another area that's getting a lot of attention right now. How is the experience of the subaltern constructed, and how is the subaltern constructing themselves in cyberspace? This would be an interesting moment to think about. We talk within critical digital humanities or post-colonial digital humanities about the subaltern in cyberspace, but there are people who cannot be on the internet for their safety. There are people who cannot be public about being in the United States on Twitter the way that some of us may be able to. So, we talk about how it's constructed on cyberspace. We also need to think about who's not being represented and why. There's also been great work in post-colonial media theory that looks at electronic media and post-colonial studies. And so, really, as I think the 2011 Arab Spring movement has shown, internet-based technologies are playing an important role in socio-political developments around the world. And the range of possibilities at the juncture of post-colonial studies and digital humanities, it implicates sort of a lot of the aspects of contemporary experience, whether it's the effects of globalization on capital and how microcredit and online financing are being deployed, particularly in the global south, how peer-to-peer networks are developing, who has access to digital networking tools and how they're being used, who is represented and has access to gaming environments. So this body of work really insists on a relationship between migration and mobility, capital, space, identity, temporality. They're all visible in how technologies are produced and distributed and consumed globally. So that's sort of, I know that, thank you for bearing with me through the kind of theoretical. That was a lot of theoretical stuff. That was the point at which I thought, this is where my talk's going to drag. So there are pictures coming of fun things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a few projects, because I talked about the theory, and I said that from those really two main early 90s projects of post-colonial digital humanities, retrofitted, to then the theory, which really subsumed most of the 2000s. Lately, we've had a proliferation of digital humanities projects that incorporate post-colonial perspectives. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is not a best of. This is just an attempt to show the breadth of the work that's ongoing. So this is the Bachitra Tagore Online Variorum project. This is out of Jadavpur University in India. Bachitra means various, and this is a project that's attempting to collect and digitize all of the work of Rabindranath Tagore, who was India's first Nobel Prize-winning writer who wrote in Bengali and in English. And so they're trying to digitize every text, every Tagore text that exists. And so this has been going on since 2011. And the scope of this project is immense. 47,000 pages of manuscript have been digitized. 90,000 pages of printed material has been scanned, transcribed, and made searchable. The volume makes this project and Tagore among the most digitized writers in the world. And they've also developed software that allows researchers to collate versions of the texts. So you can search across different versions of the text, or you can compare texts at 3 different levels and get the sentence level, the paragraph level, and the chapter level. And so there's a lot of ways to engage with the digitized material. It's not enough to digitize things. I mean, digitizing things I think is very important because there's so much material that isn't digitized that's sort of underrepresented. So that's why a lot of digital humanities projects are the Walt Whitman Archive, the Dickinson Electronic Archive, the Rossetti Archive. It's not usually the Tagore Archive. So the fact that somebody is digitizing Tagore is important, but that's also not enough. It has to be, how do we make this data meaningful and usable, and how can it apply to other texts as well? So this software that they're actually developing it so that you could actually use it with another author, with another author's digitized material. So that's really exciting. And their website is available in Bengali, English, and Hindi. So I mean, language access is another issue that they're negotiating. This is the 1947 Partition Archive. This is a project based in the US. It's a really exciting oral history archive from survivors of the partition of South Asia. So when in 1947, India was granted independence from the British and became India and Pakistan, it instantiated one of, if not the largest mass migration of people across the border between India and Pakistan. And there's a tremendous amount of violence, tremendous amount of trauma that accompanied the birth of these 2 nations. So volunteers, citizen historians, it could be you if you wanted to. Attend the online workshops from this archive and then take oral histories and deposit them in the repository. So they have audio and video files of partition survivors. And if you go to the website, it's really fun because they have a story map that maps the origin and then migration points of the individuals whose stories are in the archive. And then if you click on the name of the person, actually animates their migration, which is fun. And then you can search by location as well. So this is a relatively new project, but it's really exciting because this is my parents' generation, and so a lot of these people's generations are unfortunately not going to be around much longer. So getting these stories is really important, particularly because there's so much trauma that people don't talk about them. So it's a great project. This is more of a digital humanities focused, another meta kind of critical digital humanities project. This is around DH in 80 days, which is a project sponsored by GoDH, which is the Global Digital Humanities Organization. And the project's goal was, and I have to admit I was an editor, so shameless self-promotion, every day for 80 days to produce an entry on a project that's digital humanities scholarship from around the world. And the idea was to challenge the idea that the center of digital humanities is in the US and in the UK, and a little bit in Canada. So the sort of traditional map that Melissa Terrace, a British digital humanities scholar, put together shows the locations of digital humanities centers like 5 College, DH, and they're primarily in the US, UK, and there are 11 in Canada. This, however, shows a completely different map that distributes digital humanities throughout the world and is really a powerful visualization of the global diversity that does exist in the field. So each of those dots you can click and find out what the project is in the location. And so you can see my personal favorite is out west of South America. That's a Cook Islands vocabulary lexicon project, which is really neat. So this sort of represents the vitality of digital humanities around the world, but also calls attention to thinking, needing to rethink how we locate digital humanities globally. This is Reading from a Distance. This is a really neat project that was made by an undergraduate student at Swarthmore College, May Capozzi. And This is a distant reading of empire, and the project considers how distant reading can contribute to postcolonial scholarship. So this is the kind of classic corpus linguistics-based DH data mining that you've sort of come to associate with DH. And so Capozzi and her professor, Scott Enderle, developed a corpus of 3,000 late 18th century late 18th century British texts, and then ran it into Mallet, the machine learning for language toolkit, which is corpus linguistics software, and used it to read the corpus. And they used it to draw conclusions to demonstrate what kinds of influences that colonialism played on late 18th century British literature. And one of the trends that emerged was that India, it's not a surprise, had an important role in the literary imagination of late 18th century British writers. So they have sort of some topic modeling, and they have a network graph that is available on the site as well. And so this is a way of thinking about how technology can be engaged to read across a large number of texts, distant reading, to think about colonialism as a broader trend within British literature. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you why it's kind of hard to do this work, particularly if it's something you're interested in going into. Despite the exciting work that currently exists, there are challenges. Within the broader landscape of digital humanities, this is not a widely represented body of work. And it's largely, I think, by virtue of the data that's available to study. Again, I mentioned that a lot of the early digital humanities projects were Walt Whitman, Rossetti. There's, I guess, people have done work on Blake in the digital humanities. And these are texts that are in the public domain. So 1923 is our cutoff for public domain texts. And so that restricts what we're able to kind of make public as a data set because of copyright law. So contemporary postcolonial writing doesn't really work. Fair use laws as well don't protect usage on the internet, and there are a lot of debates among people about how to handle it. Do you just kind of flaunt the law? I'm not recommending that. And have a good takedown notice, so you'll take it down if somebody complains. Or, do you just not do the work? And really, most scholars are erring on the side of not doing that. I mean, nobody wants to get sued, so it's generally a good idea. Don't get sued. If there's anything you learned, don't violate copyright. Funding is a problem as well. The infrastructure needed to create projects is unevenly distributed. It's unevenly distributed globally. It's unevenly distributed within institutions in the United States. I don't have a digital humanities center at my institution. It is my goal in life to build one. And I have a faculty learning community, which is a start. But even within the US, who is able to do the work and who has the time and the resources and the institutional funding to do it varies as well. And if you look back to this map for around DH, one of the things I didn't tell you, which you'd find if you go look at it, is that a lot of the projects that aren't in the US are partnered with US institutions. Not all of them, but a number of them are, and that's important because it makes us think about, are there neo-colonial dynamics at work influencing the interactions between institutions in the global north and the global south. It doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but it could be. It's something we need to be aware of. Another area of concern is whether local communities support the development of digital projects. For example, in India, there's actually a lot of funding to do digital humanities work. It's kind of surprising because in the Indian educational system, you don't go and get your undergraduate degree with your liberal arts and you get like a little science and a little literature and history and you become a well-rounded person. You hyper-specialize very young. So what ends up happening is that you don't have digital humanities scholars because you had people who trained in the sciences or people who trained in the humanities. But there is actually now more and more funding for it. But often you'll have local communities that don't want their material digitized. Particularly, this is the case for of digital heritage projects or cultural preservation projects, people don't want their stuff digitized. They don't know. They don't want it available. They don't know what you're going to do with it. And so that's another obstacle. Even if the money is there, you have different attitudes towards the material itself and what you're going to do with it. Then just sort of institutionally, issues related to this work are that digital humanities projects may not always count for as scholarship for tenure committees or hiring or promotion committees. Although this is really exciting because I just got my letter the other day. I got reappointed, and they specifically noted my digital scholarship under scholarship. And it's I'm the first person to try that at my institution, and they were really confused. And when I asked the union about it, the union was, what? What is this digital scholarship? Don't try and give them a CD. Print it all out. So, there are institutional barriers as well. But as I hope I've sort of given an indication of to you today, there's so much exciting and productive work that's being done and that's still to be done at the intersections of postcolonial studies and the digital humanities, that it's sort of timely and generative and so important in light of the geopolitical circumstances of our contemporary world. And it gives us a lens to think about technology and its implication in the dynamics of colonialism that still persist in many ways. And it also adds that framework and lens of postcolonial studies to the work that has been increasingly come to be known as critical digital humanities. So I'm going to stop there, because I've talked for long enough, and I want to make sure that we have ample time for questions. And Marissa asked me if I would moderate my Q&A myself, so I'm happy to do so. So please go ahead and let me know what questions you have. Thank you.
So I have a very practical question, and I'm embarrassed to ask it as a librarian. But how do you keep up with digital scholarship projects that are popping up all over the place?
Twitter this is interesting because one of the things that I was telling Marissa earlier is I work at an institution with a high teaching load. So most of my colleagues have 4.4s. I've yet to actually teach a 4.4. Sort of, I shouldn't say my goal is to not teach a 4.4. But people bemoan that you can't keep up with scholarship with the teaching load that heavy. And the thing is, it's so bizarre to me because I feel like I get on Twitter 3 times a day and I just read the digital humanities lists that people have put together. And I feel like, I'm not sort of super current on everything, but I feel like I have a general handle on what's going on because people are advertising it more and more. And I feel like Twitter and, to a lesser extent, Facebook have really changed scholarly communication in that way, particularly because people are being more public about the work that they're doing. And so let's just keep track of it. Although I will say, with around DH, there were definitely moments, because I was a South Asia editor, I was like, I need a South Asia project. Where's a South Asia project? And where's a good one, too? We don't want any South Asia project or any DH project for that map. But, there are definitely, I think that's my way of keeping up.
Hold my hand around. Hi, I'm Jeffrey. I was wondering if you could speak. I was really interested in when you briefly mentioned microtransactions in the global south, and it got me thinking about the ways that what even constitutes the digital materially is different in the west and the north and the south. I had a conversation with Marissa about the prevalence of cellular networks in Africa, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about just describing the ways in which what constitutes the internet and digital vary from place to place.
That's not a tall order or anything. The digital in every country known to man. All the things. Well, here's a cop-out answer. And this is I wrote an article on this that I need to revise so it can be actually published, but that looked at how digital humanities is constructed. In many ways, when we talk about digital humanities, we're kind of constructing a monolith of what that is, and then within the field there's plenty of debates about what exactly constitutes digital humanities. And one of the troubles that we encountered when we were coming up with the criteria for evaluating your projects that were going to be in the Around DH map was that we were really skewed, our results are getting skewed by our own perceptions of what digital humanities is. And so I came up with this idea about, because I was talking to a colleague who's a specialist in English language learners, and she was telling me all about written accent is one of these concepts that's now really important, that your writing has an accent. And so you could belabor every grammar error in the writing of an English language learner, but that may not be the best or the most effective use of your time. Instead, maybe it's to recognize that their writing has an accent, that all our writing has accents, the academic writing as a genre has an accent, that Twitter has an accent. Different genres and forms of writing have accents, and individuals have them as well. I mean, you could call it style, but in English language learning scholarship, it's called an accent. And so I wrote this article about thinking about the digital humanities accent. So what may look like a very flashy project in one cultural context may not in another. And so this happens to sort of fall along the lines of questions that have emerged in digital humanities in the US, kind of policing what is and what isn't, or what counts or doesn't count as digital humanities. And my way around it was to say, well, why don't we talk about it as locally constructed and contextual. And so that was a way, and people actually thought this was kind of interesting concept because it was a way out of digital humanities as this one entity, and a way out, like you would say, about digital, what the digital is in one context or another. Oops, I didn't mean to do that.
That seems to be strikingly relevant. I mean, why would we recreate more structures of hierarchy and inclusion, right? Mm-hmm. in the sort of named attempt not to do.
It's true, and I mean, I don't think it. The reality is that not everything is not everything. Profound thoughts. That if you that which is Victorian literature means something. It's not something I wrote yesterday. It's not Victorian literature. I mean, exclusions exist because if we categorize things, and we have to categorize things to get funding, to get jobs, to publish in journals, to give talks, and we have to categorize our work. But at the same time, the question there is, how do we not sort of become exclusionary about what could fit and may fit in another context?
I wanted to just follow up on Dunstan's question and ask not so much about how you keep up with your field, but how you sort of archive your field, so that if somebody were starting a project now, they could go back to all those bits of pieces, they may not be able to go back to all those other pieces that you did. So what's your way of thinking that through and sending students out to do research, or in thinking about how to keep track of where things are developing within the Twitter feeds?
Oh, so specifically, if all that information is out there, how do I keep track of it?
Right, yeah, how do I categorize it in some ways?
I mean, just practically, I use the tarot.
But then you're talking about an individual. You're talking about an individual way of categorizing
Yeah.
as opposed to a library way or...
That's true. That is an individual way. I mean, I'm trying to think in terms of ways that scholarship is archived. Digital Humanities Now is a website that has sort of crowdsourced, or editors at large, who they have a week assigned to them, and they keep track of what's coming out in the Twitter sphere that week, and then they can nominate things for editors' pick. But then, that reflects whatever the particular bias of the editors themselves are. In terms of the broader question, I think that your question also raises the issue of how sustainable these projects are. that, funding is not infinite. The internet is sort of forever, but then you get projects like this one. That is forever on the internet. And then anything can be, if you have the URL, can be accessed through the Wayback Machine. But, this project, Landau made an intentional decision to write a statement saying he was archiving it as is at a certain point of time. But then, Amy Earhart has done a lot of work on the history of digital humanities, and one of the challenges she found is that these websites don't exist anymore. These early digital recovery projects that were being done in the 90s, particularly with scholars in African American lit and U.S. ethnic lit, using the internet to recover texts that weren't available or out of print, and to kind of challenge the canon in that way, that those sites don't exist anymore. So, there's the additional challenge not only of how do you archive the knowledge of the field, but then what's going to be around when you go back to it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and there's something so compelling in thinking about that. I was thinking about how one thing I've always struggled with, just in that moment of sort of looking for projects and thinking about how people are talking about projects, are those sort of earlier sort of 90s post-colonial web moments where people were doing important humanities work around ethnic life using digital forms. And then the rise in the 2000s of digital humanities writ large. And the ways in which that second thing can't necessarily accommodate the first necessarily, because the second thing is also time to really complex conversations about like blended learning and teaching and tools that technically one might imagine makes a separate conversation. So what I'm talking about, for instance, are the ways in which so many technologies we associate now with digital humanities, are tools that are being produced so we can offer better online courses, for instance, or tools that are being produced, or trickle downs, to use a different kind of example, trickle downs from government technology, as most of our technologies are, right? And so we're stuck in this difficult place where so much of the dream of what the digital could do for certain populations, I'm thinking again, like recovering African American, early African American texts, gets lost in the shuffle, right? And it's difficult to imagine, and also aside that, sorry, what's going on, I'm also thinking alongside that, the ways in which so many institutions, particularly libraries, produce digital projects that don't necessarily have a life beyond an institution. And maybe there's something wrong with that. Maybe the digital is just another form in which, just like paper or anything else, is held by institutions. But that seems in some level, by necessity, in contradiction to the dream of what the digital was going to do for us in the first place, and minority life and thinking about those kinds of projects. So I'm sorry I'm going more comment than question, but I just find this site is really important to me early in my own development, and it's been really compelling. It is a way back on that machine moment.
Me too. I mean,
Really, wow.
that was when I learned, I took a class in college. It was postcolonial lit. It was just, I went to UPenn undergrad, and they had this honors program, and so I just took this class, and it was Bodies and Borders in Postcolonial Literature. I had no idea what I was signing up for. I had no clue. I had tried to read Midnight's Children once, because I worked at Barnes & Noble, and it was on the books everybody was buying table, so I bought a copy, and I tried to read it. Couldn't do it. I took this class, and it was a research-based class, so I had to write a seminar paper, and I think it was my sophomore year of college, and it was just mind-blowing. And I found this website, and I found Deepika Bari's website, and she turned out to be my dissertation advisor much later. But these were so important for me, and I never would have really understood the breadth of postcolonial studies if not for this site. And in retrospect, you look at it, and you're like, this is a drop in the bucket of scholarship, but it was so important as an undergraduate and then thinking about doing a master's degree to see that the scholarship was out there and accessible to me in a way that, reading Baba wasn't at that point. Well, still. It's still not accessible. But I think the other thing is that this is why I will always fight the battle for being expansive about defining digital humanities, because if we think about the ways historically that the work of, I guess what we could call minorities has been policed and excluded and devalued, that we can't let that happen in the digital humanities. We can't say this digital recovery project on, I don't know, there was one on a Clotel. There's a project on Clotel. We can't say that that project isn't valuable because it doesn't have like flashy things, it doesn't have a tool that got built yesterday with like $1 million NEH grant. We can't say that, or else we ignore the possibilities of digital scholarship for those particular histories and those particular literatures.
I'm struck by this map that's really post-British colonial digital humanities, and I'm wondering about the post-French colonial, post-Spanish colonial. Are they all in their own silos, kind of lagging behind because the internet is so English-oriented, or?
No, that's actually funny because I'm at the HASAC conference. I'm moderating a panel on D/post/colonial digital humanities, and we called it that on purpose because we just wanted to complicate this phrase. I mean, global digital humanities is sort of its own thing, and it's more of a special interest group of scholars. It's not really a body of scholarship. But, there's lots of room to, I think, complicate these paradigms. I mean, I don't think the post-colonial is a framework that's free from critique of its own. And I mean, I think this is sort of more of an umbrella term for those kinds of engagements. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done, for example, on what's the role of the nation in digital humanities globally, and particularly in relation to thinking about post-coloniality. Because post-coloniality means something different in Australia than it does in the U.S., for example.
Your Lord of you, post or DH Center for the World on this map.
Yeah.
And how well they match up. According to colonial projects do and don't. There's something telling you about.
Could I ask a question about that DH and AA's map? So are those projects based in those locations, or are those projects about something in those locations?
They're based in, they're not about, because we didn't want it to be, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented, as Marx would say. But the caveat is that there are people on the ground in individual locations doing that work, but there's also often partnerships with institutions in other places, particularly projects on the African continent. That's definitely an area where there's a lot of partners with the U.S. institutions in particular. And also, there's a lot of projects that sound like Africa's a country. Like the African Archive of blah, 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 that includes Botswana and South Africa and Gambia. I mean, places that aren't even near each other, but are just the African Video Archive. So this is kind of, that's a whole area of digital humanities that, I'm curious to sort of see how it keeps developing.
Please. Thank you. I wanted to return to your point about fair use, because the fair use question has been very mindfully challenged by, a few years ago, documentary filmmakers, more recently by the College Art Association, looking for ways to use fair use provisions so as not to end up with an overly driven copyright law that even sometimes the lawyers for copyright holders don't want. They only know how to say don't use it, and designers only know how to say I don't want to get sued. And that's a scenario that goes nowhere, even though there exists fair use provisions. I'm open at the moment at a place called the Center for Media and Social Impact at American University, where Patricia Aufderheide and Peter Yazzie directed the Code of Best Practices for Documentary Filmmakers, and got the lawyers for intellectual property and copyright holders to agree, and so it's kind of taken off. And just recently, the College Art Association has issued a code of best practices and fair use for the visual arts, which includes online media. So I don't know if that's a bit of the future for digital humanities, but I think it's really critically important to to not retreat from de facto litigiousness and look at the ways in which people have been cooperating across the presumed line of self or group interest to open up fair use, which in a really important sense can't be as controlled as the application would make it seem.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a really important idea. I mean, I think that the way that permissions, for example, with the press are structured, it seems like such a monodirectional, you go to these people and they give you permissions. But then I was talking to my editor yesterday and she told me, oh, if you have a screenshot, it doesn't matter. You don't need a permission. Well, what if you screenshot copyrighted material? I mean, what if it doesn't have a Creative Commons license? You know, but yeah. Yeah.
You know, you speak to your person using it, the proportion of the original material you're using, etc. That's covered.
Well, this is sort of going down the fair use road a little bit, but I was fascinated by the Georgia Tech lawsuit, that the 10% fair use percentage has been challenged now legally, and that then you just, what do we do now? But I love your point though that there are ways to not shy away from it and to work with
that, because the 10% provision is in place. It's Disney has challenged every conceivable interpretation of copyright law and has gotten lots of sort of automatic copyright extensions. It's one of the most famous ones, and it's not that there are people trying to claim and protect intellectual property as theirs, but the fear of lawsuits, I think, has obstructed a lot of extending these existing fair use projects. And our institutions have to protect individual users. So if anyone knows I think fair use is a really kind of cutting-edge digital humanities project. And maybe it's going on.
I mean, in certain ways. I mean, for example, there's just an affidavit that a lot of scholars of digital humanities signed related to a Google Books lawsuit. I was one of the signatories of that. And so, there is, and then of course net neutrality as well. Thinking broadly beyond digital humanities projects into the broader issues like you mentioned, copyright, open access, net neutrality. I think there are a number of ways that there are digital humanities scholars being involved around those issues.
I have a question that I'm still trying to formulate. I think so forgive me if it actually makes no sense, but a question about how to form a meta discourse around a new discipline. I'm coming at this conversation from the territorial studies background, which is also a field and also sort of talking about itself in ways that it's still trying to figure out. And I think my question is coming from sort of the first part of your talk, which seems like it was looking at the field in sort of an additive way. So you're thinking about how to think through computation plus humanity plus new media plus critical theory plus sort of whatever. And I think also a response to your answer, you're sort of claiming for an expansive definition of what this field is, which I understand in terms of the sort of ethics of sort of how you use the field, but I have a question about whether that plus the sort of the impulse for the sort of additive sort of critical fields, sort of how then can you create a meta discourse when the sort of specificity is one of expansion? So the sort of the does that make sense? I guess I would try to explain it differently.
Say a little bit more about the additive.
So, forgive me if this is actually incorrect when we did this conversation, but it seems like the way that you're trying to sort of support a meta discourse around digital humanities is something about. So we have this discourse around the humanities that includes things like theory, which is things from literature, from other discourses that we know. We have this discourse around competition, around digital, around media, around sort of other things that have to do with the digital. And it seems like the impulse for the discourse is adding those things together and sort of seeing what happens. And then my concern then is if the focus is on kind of expansive definition of what the field is, how then can we how can another discourse emerge when the emphasis is on connection and not
Well, I mean, I see the expansive definition as something separate. I mean, I do think that there is a definition. I just think that, so sort of not to go so into the intricacies of debates about digital humanities that nobody really cares about, but so the main issue is that there are scholars who worked in humanities computing for a very long time that were specifically about textual studies and book history, and there's a lot of work with corpus linguistics, computational technologies. And so now within the digital humanities, that's part of it, but then it's sort of coming to be accepted that also theoretical interpretations of technology or electronic media, the digital itself as an object of study, not just textual objects studied with digital methods, is how the field has come to be defined. I'm not really making the case that that's so. That work's already been done by other people, and there are lots of in-group arguments about this. But so, I mean, in saying I'm drawing on that definition isn't to say that I'm creating that or that it's additive. It's just that is what really marks the difference between digital humanities versus this older field of humanities computing from which it came from my perspective, at least. So the issue of the meta discourse is really about looking at the ways that certain conversations have been included and some certain conversations haven't been included in the conversation about the field. So the field historically hasn't really theorized the role of race in the scholarship that's produced. And so that's sort of, I guess you could call that an additive critical theory lens, but to me it's really just thinking about things that were in some ways always there but were never really talked about. Like why, for example, are all these early projects on primarily male, canonical, white authors, and where are those absences? And I don't really think it is additive, because it's a question that postcolonial studies has asked of every other branch of, every other field in British literature, right? I mean, where is imperialism inflecting Victorian literature? I mean, that's a question postcolonial studies has asked. It's a question, so area of work that Victorianists do. So it's not so much to me, I think, an additive, but it's a way of asking about what is and isn't already there. I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but I mean, I don't see it as putting critical theory on it. I mean, I think we're already sort of living within these constructs of power that have shaped this field, and now we kind of need to look at it and understand how the field came to be what it is. I mean, that's what I would say. I think it's an ethical imperative, not an additive lens.
Somewhat related to that, on your Google Analytics graphic, there's a total dropout in the digital humanities term itself from like 2006 to 2007. What happened? Is that artificial? Is that an error, or did something really happen in the discourse at that point?
Well, okay, so we don't have the other accent. Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I mean, there's on the actual, I mean, this is a screenshot, and there really was no y-axis of like what that even means. That's why I said don't make methodological conclusions about this graph. But I mean, well, 2007 is generally considered the moment that the term began to take off as the title of a companion, because Blackwell, John Unsworth's Blackwell Companion to Digital Humanities. And that was the first moment, and that was the beginning of the upward trajectory. So the real question is sort of what's happening before that moment.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's meant to.
It would be interesting to know more about what this represents.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing about Google Trends. They don't really give you enough data to make any meaningful conclusions. I mean, you'd have to really collect the data and do your own analysis to say anything real about this.
I wanted to ask a question about the postcolonial studies aspect of digital humanities. So it seems like you're bringing a lot of really important questions from postcolonial DH into digital humanities, digital humanities. But I'm wondering if they're just looking at postcolonial studies composite and kind of the conversations that are happening. I'm not really seeing any element of digital humanities. So I guess I wanted to say a few words about what the relationship to postcolonial as a field. Clearly you're part of the project, but I guess why I don't know. It seems like there's not much of a conversation with more conventional postcolonial studies conferences and also talking about.
Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things I didn't say as much about is that, postcolonial scholarship, anybody who's sort of done postcolonial studies knows that you're already doing this interdisciplinary work that already has its own issues. This is an additional layer of complication, and most canonical postcolonial studies people don't get it at all. And some are interested in it, and some are like, this is crap. And it's really hard. And that's one of the challenges, is that there aren't many digital humanities journals. The digital humanities journals don't really care, and they're starting to care more about critical digital humanities. But when I first started doing this work, they didn't care. And so I was like, where do you put any of this work? And so the answer is you put it on your blog. You put it on Twitter. You make your own website. Because where else is it going to go? And then you hope by over time you convince people that there's some merit to it, and then they give you a book contract. So there's going to be a book on it. Because I'm writing it, but on the other hand, there's a new collection from Routledge coming out on postcolonial studies, contemporary postcolonial studies. There's going to be a section on postcolonial digital humanities. I mean, it's not going to get there unless the people who do the work try and make the case for it. And you have to be resilient, and you have to understand there are people who aren't going to get it, and there are people who, you'd think that postcolonialists would sort of want to be predisposed to understand that there are difficulties doing this kind of work, because they should know from being postcolonialists. But it isn't always like that. And I could tell you a story about a conference that I went to. And I had been asked by a colleague to put together a roundtable on the subject of the conference, which was related to postcolonial studies, and the digital humanities. So I write up this proposal and give it to them. And the first thing is they send me an email and say they've accepted the panel, but it can't be a round table. We can't have round tables. We need 20-minute papers in which everybody reads their papers. It's like, okay, first of all, I mean, if a round table is too radical for your conference, I feel like this is entirely foolhardy plan whatsoever, because I'd frankly rather go to a round table and somebody talk to me for 20 minutes. I'd rather have a conversation with these people and ask them more questions than listen to them read to me. That's just my preference. And so they had some internal executive committee drama about it that I never heard more about. And in fact, it was the one round table on the conference program, and it was on digital humanities and the subject of the conference. And then I go to a panel the morning before mine with a friend, and with the permission of the person who was speaking, we were live tweeting the person's talk. And it was not on digital humanities. It was just on the something postcolonial. And he was so excited. Oh, you want to live tweet my talk? This is so exciting. we're doing our live tweeting. The conference organizer comes up to us and asks us to leave. He says, why don't you take that outside? Because I don't know if he thought we were just on Twitter and not paying attention as opposed to live tweeting what the person was saying. And then I said to my friend, I said, this is why I don't come to this conference. And I came to this conference as a favor to my other person who wanted me to put together this panel because he wanted this field to see digital humanities and get interested in it. So I said, this is why I don't come, because you tweet things and then they tell you to leave because they think you're just like not paying attention to the speaker. And I mean, that's, I think, an extreme example of how badly this can go and how misunderstood the kind of common practices, the sort of the way, the genre that are in which digital humanities articles are written versus postcolonial studies articles. I mean, that's why it doesn't exist. But you know what? I mean, that's something I'm working to change. And there are other people who are working to change it too. And hopefully in 2017, there'll be a book on it. So postcolonialists can read it. And the audience is postcolonialists who don't really know anything about digital humanities and digital humanists who don't know anything about postcolonial studies. And it's called Postcolonial Digital Humanities. And I'm the person in the middle trying to say, talk to each other. Make your disciplines legible to each other. There's so many important things that will happen if these conversations can flourish. So there's a marketing department at a press that seems to think this is marketable, right? So hopefully it'll happen.
So we should probably let our guests go. Ms. Dowling, thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much.